Hi there, welcome to the first of 3 videos we are doing in defined benefits. We are seeing a huge increase in this area, as I'm sure many of you are, so we thought we would pull together some of the information and the knowledge that we've got from other advisors, from paraplanners, from compliance teams, even from PI insurers, and create a series with some hints and tips and guidance to help you in this area. We've split these into 3 themes, so this first video will look at some of the more practical aspects of it. The second video will look at a bit more technical detail on defined benefits, and the third will look at it from a compliance point of view and things that you should maybe be aware of. So the first practical consideration I would say is the qualifications that you can do in occupational pension reviews, the G60, AF3, even the new AF7, are very good for providing a framework on these, but they're literally just that, they're just a framework, and it's not until you really get stuck into schemes that you get to understand the subtleties and the nuances between various defined benefit schemes. What I would therefore say is, for every single case, you should approach it with a completely blank sheet of paper. Even if it seems similar to a scheme that you've worked on before, assume no knowledge at all on that scheme. They've all got such flexibility within their scheme rules and the way that they can approach things that it can be tricky to bring in any kind of pre-knowledge of that scheme. We've even seen cases where it appeared that there was 2 clients in the exact same scheme, and it turned out there was a very slightly different element of that scheme where there was just a few small changes in the escalation and the revaluation rates, but it made a big difference. So I would always approach everyone with a completely blank piece of paper and look to get full information on that scheme entirely from scratch. The second practical consideration I would suggest thinking about is risk controls, and that's risk controls for your firm. We found that the best way to manage the review of defined benefit schemes is to know as a firm what you would consider to be the maximum element of risk in each area. So for example, this could be critical yields. There could be a maximum critical yield that you would ever allow any of your advisors to consider. Another example might be risk profile. You may be unhappy if a client with a cautious risk tolerance was even considering moving away from their defined benefit scheme. Other examples would be if the defined benefit, the scheme itself was a minimum percentage of the client's overall assets, or possibly if it was a certain percentage of their income in retirement. The best thing to do is for each of these areas, and maybe for some others, is to look at your tolerances as a firm. What is the most or the least, depending on the message, that you would be comfortable with, and then combining them will give you a really solid framework to ensure that nobody's putting anything through that could be uncomfortable for the firm. The FCA are very keen on risk management. They are not so bothered about looking at a case 6 months after it's happened and doing a file check on it and saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have done it. What they want to see is that you've got something in place that will create a trigger, that will create an alert if something is breached, if something that's a little bit too risky or potentially inappropriate for a client happens. So I would definitely recommend as a firm that you sit down, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 risk controls, and agree where your tolerances lie on those and make sure that they're really clearly communicated to all the advisors. Mentioned within that critical yields, and I think people have thought for a while that they are not the most accurate way of valuing or understanding the value of a scheme, and it seems that the FCA has started to catch up with that way of thinking. We've always done a critical yield. You'll see from a TVAS that you naturally get a hurdle rate anyway, which is the income but based on a level annuity, and tends to come out much lower than a critical yield. And we also tend to do a drawdown growth calculation. This is basically taking the CETV, putting it into a drawdown plan, and looking at the income that would have been available from the defined benefit scheme, including the increases and the revaluation each year, and seeing what growth rate would be required from the drawdown pension in order to reflect those benefits, in order to match them. You can then make a judgment call on the critical yield or the hurdle rate or the drawdown growth rate as to how likely that is and how suitable that is based on the client's risk profile and on the recommended portfolio. What we tend to do is document all of these, and we have a glossary that explains these terms to the client, but then we'll pick the one measure that is most appropriate to that particular client. So depending on their likely way of retiring, their likely way of accessing benefits, we'll pick the measure that's most suitable to them and then put more detailed comment around that, around their personal objectives and around their personal risk profile. So the FCA are changing their stance on critical yield, but it could be quite some time until that comes out, and it might be worth just considering some of these other measures in the meantime for more thoroughness. One other practical consideration I would say is really, really important is the client's age. We are still seeing quite a lot that come through where the client is really keen to take advantage of pension freedoms. The ability to access your pension fund as and when you want rather than a fixed income is understandably very appealing to some clients. The difficulty is when we're seeing them for clients who are aged 40 and they're not planning on retiring until they're 60 or 65. I, for one, wouldn't want to try and guess what the pension landscape will look like in 25 years. Things change so rapidly that making a judgment and moving it out of something with the guarantees of a defined benefit scheme purely for pension freedoms, which may or may not be around, could be drastically different by the time the client accesses the benefits, isn't really in their best interest, and I've not yet seen a compliance team that's happy with that either. So looking at the client's age and their term until retirement is a really, really key point, and there should be really serious consideration given as to whether the review of this scheme and what might happen to it could be deferred until they're closer to the point at which they'll actually access the benefits and the pension landscape at that time will be better known. So these are just a few brief practical pointers. I hope there's something helpful there for you, and in the next one we will look at some more of the techie details around defined benefits. Thank you very much.